Thank you for joining us this evening for the launch of our 2022 Nonfiction Writer-in-Residence program. We are delighted to have our new Nonfiction Writer-in-Residence, Eternity Martis, joining us for a conversation with Kamal Al-Solaylee. My name is Gwen Bird, and I'm Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this wonderful evening. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking this evening from the unceded, traditional, and current territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations on SFU's Burnaby campus. Those of us who are settlers on this land have an obligation to address the historic and ongoing legacies of colonization and the damage this has done to Indigenous peoples and communities. These impacts are at the personal, institutional, and systemic levels. As an educational institution, SFU has a particular responsibility in this area, and we work to make the university an instrument of reconciliation. So it's my privilege to welcome you all to this event to celebrate Eternity Martis, who is joining us as SFU Library's 2022 Nonfiction Writer-in-Residence. I'd like to thank our event partner, SFU Public Square, for making this evening possible. And before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. Please note that this event is being recorded. We do have closed captioning available today, which you can access by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Thank you to AI Media for providing the captioning. Please make sure that you are familiar with our community guidelines for this event, which will be shared here in the chat. If you'd like to ask questions of our speakers, please submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen at any time during the event. I'll try to get to as many of these as we can during a brief Q&A period toward the end of the event. I want to say just a few words about the Nonfiction Writer-in-Residence program that we're launching today. Eternity Martis joins SFU Library as our second Nonfiction Writer-in-Residence. We established this initiative last year to celebrate and emphasize the power of nonfiction writing and storytelling, and to foster the SFU community's abilities to share information, knowledge, and research beyond academia. As the Nonfiction Writer-in-Residence, Eternity will be facilitating a series of engaging workshops for the SFU community. And she has a fabulous lineup on topics such as nonfiction book proposals, memoir and personal essay writing, and how to write about trauma, violence, death, and dark times. She'll also be available for one-on-one writing consultations. And you're invited to follow the link in the chat to see a list of all of Eternity's planned activities during her residency. Please make sure to register and secure your spot. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's wonderful student moderator who will present our speakers and invite them to share a reading. Hi, Emily. Emily Lam is a fourth-year SFU student studying health sciences and business. Emily has been a peer educator in the library's Student Learning Commons since 2019. She describes herself as an aggressively caring individual, a serial multitasker, and the type of person who laughs before the joke is told. Emily is most excited about children's mental health, stigma reduction, and trauma-informed practice, and how that can help build healthier and more equitable communities. Emily also has interests in housing and social policy, storytelling, and cultural community connections. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Emily to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Gwen, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily. Okay, I wasn't before, but now I'm a little nervous. I think it might have to do with being in the presence of two amazing people doing amazing things. But nerves aside, I'm so very excited to get this discussion going and the conversation flowing. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories and stolen and unceded lands on which I am situated, of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations, colonially known as Port Moody, BC. I'm here as an uninvited settler, and I think about the vibrant cultures and communities and the beautiful land that I am so privileged to stand on. I'm appreciative as a guest to this land to listen and learn and open my heart and mind to the stories and wisdoms of these nations. So as I share my voice in this space with you tonight, I'm grateful for all of those before me who have taught me or inspired me or influenced the stories I tell and the way I exist. So a couple of deep breaths to digest that. And now I would like us to turn our attention to Eternity. Eternity Martis is a multi-award-winning Toronto-based journalist whose work on race and language has influenced media style guide changes across the country. She's the course developer and instructor of reporting on race, the Black community in the media at Ryerson University, which is the first of its kind in Canada. She's also the 2021 Asper Visiting Professor at UBC. In 2020, she was named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by Women's Executive Network. Eternity's best-selling memoir, debut memoir, is They Said This Would Be Fun: Race, Campus Life, and Growing Up. You probably can't see it, but I have stars in my eyes just from reading that bio to you. So now it is my honor and absolute pleasure to invite Eternity to come on up and share a reading with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Emily, so much for that great introduction. And good evening, and to everyone here, good night if you're in Toronto or in an Eastern time zone like me. I can't even begin to express how excited I am to begin this term this way with all of you as the second nonfiction writer in residence here at SFU. And I'm really looking forward to, like Gwen said, getting into it, starting the workshopping, starting the writing, the consulting with all of you who are interested. And I want to just take a moment to thank SFU Library and SFU Public Square for just organizing this event and all the wonderful events to come. I know there's been a lot of hard work that's been put into this over the last couple of months. So I really appreciate that. So to begin, I am going to share a reading with you from my memoir, They Said This Would Be Fun. And I was thinking about what I could read today, and I decided to choose something from the epilogue. And the reason I chose this is because all of this that we're doing today and for the next term, over the term, is about nonfiction writing. And Kamal and I are both journalists. And for a long time, very early on in my career, I always thought about the personal. What did writing personal stories mean? What did narrative mean? But as a journalist, I often felt like, I had to tell these stories that were more objective. And so I put the personal on hold for a long time. But as you've seen over the last couple of years, the personal is political. It hasn't changed at all. And I think when we look at the political climate that we're in, the cultural climate that we're in today, personal writing and sharing our stories has never been more important. And so I want to share a passage from the end of the book, the very couple last pages and last paragraphs of the book, about the importance of personal writing and the power it holds for all of us. The resistance is not just about marching down the street or staging a physical protest. It's in the health researchers collecting race-based data, the writers covering underreported stories, the lawyers representing clients against state violence, the experts documenting violence against women, the teachers pushing for more inclusive curriculums, the journalists and advocates risking their lives for the truth. It's in the tools we use in this fight against hate: social media to share our stories and engage with others, video to capture unlawful acts, retweets and shares that expose injustices and counter false information. In this new era, born out of past hard-won freedoms and causes, fueled by rage and unity, we all can play a role in dismantling systems that have benefited from keeping us silent. But there is a price to pay for standing up for what's right: harassment, doxing, loss of opportunities, threats, violence. There are whispered concerns from others, sometimes even our own families, to stay quiet, to not make a scene. There are dismissive comments that we're exaggerating, crazy, or too sensitive. Others firmly remind us to know our place. They tell us that we must respect authority, that we deserve harm if we don't. I opened this book with a quote that is often attributed to author Zora Neale Hurston. If you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. It is not surprising that powerful institutions aim to silence the voices of the marginalized and twist their truths to benefit their own narrative. Neither is it surprising how stereotypes are reproduced and maintained to justify the discrimination and the violence against queer and trans people and against bodies of color. How misogyny turns us against women to maintain gender inequality and oppression. Those oppressed under systems of oppression are always at the expense of the oppressor's narrative. But the status quo knows the power of our stories and the power that they have to make these systems crumble. Now, this death that Neil Hurston talks about is also metaphorical. If we don't speak up, our silence will kill every single one of us. If we let ourselves be told our experiences don't matter, that we are too young, too old, too unworthy, too angry, we will internalize our pain and it will eat us up alive. Sharing stories is an evolutionary act. Oral storytelling has been practiced around the world since ancient times, a way to pass on values, narratives, and cultures to future generations. Storytelling today often comes in the form of writing, putting pen to paper or fingers to a keyboard, a way to mark our permanent place in the public record. Writing in itself is radical resistance. It's a triumph. People can try to stop you from speaking your truth, but no one can take your words away from you. Personal writing by marginalized groups has often been treated as lazy and self-indulgent by the same critics who praise white male memoirists. Yet writing about oneself has long been a means of survival for the most marginalized of groups. Survivors of slavery, residential schools, segregation, conversion therapy, and abuse. There's a reason these memoirs continue to be popular. They bring together our common threads of pain, trauma, joy, and healing. They remind us that, though much has changed for the better, some things have stayed the same. That all struggles and victories are tied to past history, and that history will repeat itself if we don't start to rewrite it. Our voices can join a legacy of stories that have changed the world, that create quiet revelations and roaring revolutions. We did not put ourselves in this current cultural climate, but we are responsible for getting each other out. And I have complete faith that we can. We are glowing with rage, the kind that can shatter glass ceilings and scorch the earth. We are emotional with grief, with tears that can flood oceans and put out blazing fires. And we are soft with compassion, yet powerful enough to dissolve borders. Our words are cutting, deep enough to slash through the pages of history and write it anew. So, write, live your truth, speak up, and rage, because the time for silence has passed. Thank you.
Eternity, that was haunting. That was beautiful. That was powerful all in one. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'm very excited to hear more from you later tonight. As a brief reminder, everyone, if you would like to ask any questions to either of our speakers, please submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Up next, we have an equally amazing human being. Kamal Al-Solaylee is an award-winning author and the director of the School of Journalism, Writing, and Media at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He is the author of the national bestseller, Intolerable, a memoir of extremes, which won the 2013 Toronto Book Award and was a finalist for the CBC's Canada Reads and the Hilary Weston's Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction. His second book, Brown, What Being Brown in the World Today Means to Everyone, was a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Awards for Nonfiction, the Trillium Book Award, and won the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. His most recent book is Return, Why We Go Back to Where We Came From. Wow, I don't know about you, but that's pretty impressive. Let's welcome Kamal to our virtual stage. And Kamal, please take it away when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Emily. Good evening, everyone. Note to self, if you have to read the same event with Eternity, you go first, but she's a tough act to follow. But before I start reading, I also want to thank Gwen, Sakshi, Chloe, and everyone from SFU Library and SFU Public Square for making this happen. I'm going to pick the baton from Eternity's note about writing about the self. My book, My New Book Return, is a book of reporting and political analysis, but it starts from a very personal place. And while Eternity read from the epilogue, I'm going to read from the introduction, the very first 3 pages. Where do you want to be buried? Since my date and I were walking alongside Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Midtown Toronto, the question didn't come as a complete surprise. Its morbidity threw me off nonetheless. I had planned this to be a romantic post-dinner summer stroll. My dream list of questions included, but was not limited to, do you want to move in together? And where would you like to go for our honeymoon? He and I had just braved the crowds at a nearby ice cream shop and devoured double servings of pistachio and chocolate gelato in a scene worthy of a rom-com. Toronto, I replied. Although I was born in Yemen, raised in Lebanon and Egypt, and educated in England, I had come to see Toronto and Canada as my homeland. I reveled in the kindness the city had shown me and the career opportunities it had afforded me. I dedicated my first book to it for giving me what I'd been looking for, a home. In my second, I called it my sanctuary, a good place to be brown. My love affair with Toronto started the moment I landed at its international airport on April 20th, 1996. Like many immigrants who have left oppressive regimes or escaped civil wars, I think of that arrival date as a second birthday, a parallel timeline in which life began just as I was about to turn 32. I no longer entertained thoughts of a secret, unled life because I finally had the one I deserved. I want to be buried in Sana'a next to my grandparents, countered my date, who was born near Detroit to a Yemeni family and had spent most of his adult life in the United States. Although he was a natural-born citizen, he didn't think that America deserved his remains because he had never felt connected to it as a country of birth or of residence. I remember thinking how fortunate I was to claim a dot on the world map as mine, one place for my body to play, love, work, grow old, and when the time came, to be put to rest. My date's words suggested an inner turmoil and unbelonging to which I was immune. That exchange took place in August 2012. Barack Obama was 3 months away from winning his second term as a president of the United States. I knew Donald Trump mostly as a C-list reality TV star who had cameos in Home Alone and on Sex and the City, and as the gauche multimillionaire behind the racist birther movement. Back then, very few journalists and university professors were willing to defend with a straight face the free speech rights of bigots or adopt a quote-unquote both sides approach to one race-based conflict after another, at least not publicly. If I were asked the same question today, almost a decade later, I wouldn't know how to respond. I suspect I wouldn't be as definitive about Toronto as I once was. My date's remark, which seemed irrational and troubling then, strikes me now as reasonable and in a way prescient. Our relationship has ended, but the question lingers. So much has happened to recalibrate my affinities that I've been forced to rethink my resting place and where I call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. That was absolutely captivating. And thank you so much for sharing that part of your book as well. Now I'd like, well, both of your videos and mics are already on. We're here for a rich and vibrant discussion on both of your beautiful works. So I wanted to remind the audience to submit those questions using the Q&A feature to join the conversation. Okay, let's get to it. So to start, I wanted to kick things off with a question about beginnings. We'll start with Eternity, if that's okay with you, and then we'll turn to Kamal. So tell us the story of how you came to this work. What is your why in pursuing this journey?
Ooh, that is a great question. I also just want to say that Kamal, the passage you chose to read gave me some goosebumps, which I think is always a good sign of the best kind of writing. So I think the beginning for me of this journey of writing nonfiction, it started quite early. And are we talking necessarily about the book, or are we talking about it in general? Both have big stories.
Yeah, why don't we go with both?
Okay, I'll make this part quick, but I've always wanted to write, and I actually grew up wanting to write fiction. And I don't know if anyone is in my age group here, but it was the Mary-Kate and Ashley books they used to have when they were popular, and I would read those, and I was like, these are great. And I always wanted to write, but I grew up in a family where my mom's side of the family is from Karachi, Pakistan. They came to Canada in the 70s and wanted to create this better life for their kids. And so in my family, there was never a push to be anything in particular, but there was a preference to be a doctor or a nurse. Writers just didn't really exist in the family. And yet I was incredibly lucky to have a family where they realized I liked to write, and they would, give me notebooks and pens and kind of get the creative side of my brain working, which is excellent because I'm terrible at math. And when I got to Western to do my undergrad, I had been thinking about considering writing for like as a career, but everyone around me would say, well, if you want to be a writer, if you want to write anything really, be prepared to be broke. You'll do it in your spare time, but you'll never get to do it as a job. And so I went to Western and I decided to take English, and I consumed a lot of work, but I never really saw myself represented in any of the texts we were reading. And where I did see myself represented, those were electives, and I couldn't squeeze them all into my schedule. And what I experienced at Western, just being a woman of color on campus, and for those who aren't familiar with London, it's a very white, Christian conservative city. And at the time, this was 2010, there weren't a lot of Black folks around, and we weren't even talking about race. So my nonfiction path almost started from being at Western and seeing how people interacted with me as a Black woman, seeing how my friends who were also people of color were being objectified and discriminated against. And so I came out of that experience thinking, well, someone has to write this stuff. Like, this has to be somewhere. And I had an interest in journalism. And so I figured, well, I can report on these stories, and I can do that from going out objectively and reporting on them. But I also think that this would be a great place to start talking about what me and my friends were always talking about, almost as a whisper network. And so I actually started the book while I was at Western, and I had been writing chapters, and I had written the book proposal. I think I was about 19 or 20 at the time, because it felt like something that was so important, but we weren't yet talking about, and it needed that personal angle. And so I think I published my first byline and my first piece of personal writing when I was 19. It was in the Huffington Post, and it was an essay that ended up in the book. But that's almost how it started. It was kind of being taken from Toronto, where people look like me, and being put into this environment where no one looked like me, and then hearing these stories that come up and no one talking about them. It felt like the right thing to do was, if I enjoyed journalism, was to also incorporate this part of my journey into the journalism.
Interesting. So kind of like a personal interest, but also a gap that you needed to fill, something that wasn't being talked about out in the community that you really wanted to cover.
Yes, yeah.
Amazing. What about you, Kamal?
Oh, it's so funny hearing what Eternity is saying, because I came to journalism from academia. My background is also in English. I did a PhD in English in Victorian literature, that very practical field. And I couldn't find jobs to save my life in the academy. That was back in '96. And so I became a journalist just because there were a lot of jobs back then in journalism, and there was a lot of work. There was a lot of freelance work. There's a lot of local publication, and the National Post had just started. The Globe was competing with it, so there was a lot. It's just a moment where there was a lot of work, and I started basically as a critic, a reviewer of theater, mostly theater and performing arts. But it was 13 years of being a journalist before I wrote my first personal piece. That's how I think that Eternity, when in your reading, you mentioned something about the space of the importance of personal stories. But I wasn't empowered to tell anything personal until then. And in a way that piece that I wrote became my first book, Intolerable. I was I took it as the basis of my first book, and from there I sort of began to kind of widen the kind of books that I'm interested in writing. As all personal memoirs are personal writing, they're very much, even though they require a lot of research and digging of information, they're still their starting point, and to some extent their end point, although that's debatable, is the self. I really, for my second book, Brown, I wanted something bigger. I wanted a big book of ideas, and I wanted to talk to people, and it's reported from 10 different countries around the world, looking at the concept of brownness, what it means to be brown. And Return, in a way, is kind of my third book, and in a way, the three books kind of form a trilogy, or I like to think so. And Return is a kind of reverse journey of Intolerable, because Intolerable was pretty much about me moving to the West and finding my place and being happy and getting a kind of a sense of fulfillment as an out and proud gay man that was, in my 20s when I moved out of the Middle East. And Return is written kind of almost 30 years later as someone who's in his late 50s now, or mid 50s when I at least was working on it, and really beginning to look at end of life questions about decisions, difficult decisions, like where I want to be buried, what I want to do after, say when I retire, or what is for the final act in life. I always think in terms of theater, for your final act, final number, what will you do? So in a way, it reflects how the passage of time in life, and that I'm starting to think and reconnect with the family and the land that I left behind.
So I'm hearing a lot of, it's been a journey. You've been using your experience and expertise in journalism in your work of nonfiction writing, and it's impacted a lot about what you think about, what you're reflecting on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the two books that are reported are also very personal. Like one is literally in the skin, and and one that is starts where it's book-ended by my story, but it's also interspersed with my story. It just goes outside of myself.
I love that. Okay, now that we've heard a little bit about that spark that put both of you on this path, kind of a related question to what Kamal was talking about. We'd love to hear, how has your writing in journalism, in your nonfiction writing, how has that writing changed your understanding of your own identity and your perspectives?
Trinity, you go first.
Yes, yeah, I was gearing up the question in my mind, the answer. Yeah, I think also, just to kind of piggyback off what Kamal was saying, I think even in my book, it started personal, and then it became something to me that even though it is a memoir, it feels like there was a lot of research put into it. And so I think that the two kind of paths combine for me, because especially when we're talking about race and gender-based violence, things that are not necessarily visible, or that a lot of folks don't want to see as visible or talk about, there always seems to be this, this burden of proof. And so when I went into writing this book, and much of the other work that I do on race and gender, I'm always thinking about, okay, how can I back this up? Because I shouldn't have to back it up, because these are the conversations we've had for years. We've had them with our friends and our family and, one another. But how can I show that this is not just an isolated incident? This happens, and this is not just happen. It's not happening this year or last year. This is kind of showing, as I was saying in what I had read, for centuries, all throughout history. And so for me, when I write about race and I write about gender, and even writing this book, I always think about the starting point. And to me, that starting point, especially when we're talking about anti-Black racism, is slavery. So how can I then take something that sometimes a lot of Canadians don't even know, right? A lot of Canadians don't know that slavery existed here in Canada. How do I take this big idea that people are like, well, you know, that happened, and show how that ties into systemic racism or anti-Black racism? And how can I show that the erasure or just kind of the invisibility of that topic, how can I make that so visible that you can't look away? And I think that's what good journalism does. It forces you to look. We're not forcing anyone to act, because that's not our job, but we can put everything in front of you and help you to kind of make sense of it, and then you can change your mind. And so to me, adding the personal, it's never really felt like writing something personal for the sake of writing something personal. It's almost felt like a way to highlight what I do in terms of journalism, like using my experience to show that this is common. This happens. Here's a jumping off point, but this isn't my story, and this isn't that person's story. This story has happened to our ancestors. This is a long time coming that we need to talk about this, and it's overdue. And so I kind of combine them in that way, and I think that's kind of become my thing, which is put all the facts out there because they exist. And I think some of that is the academic background. I think it's having the research skills to search things in the library and using keywords to find all the research, but using that so that people can then change their mind about deeply held beliefs, or rethink the way they've approached something, and that's for them to do. But I can be the one to use my personal writing and my journalism as a jumping point for them.
And that's definitely something that your book does. I mean, definitely interweaves the personal with the history, with the research, with the thinking, with theoretical sort of background or the theoretical framework. And very few people know how to do that really well, that kind of the weaving in between the personal and the contextual. And I think one of the many things that make your book amazing is that is such a that you do it with such I don't want to say that it's subtlety. You do the transition so expertly that it feels like it flows naturally. And of course, we as nonfiction writers always love the line breaks. I mean, the line breaks line breaks just gives us an excuse to move, to change anything we want, to move from the 21st century to the 17th century if we want, because a line break gives us that freedom. So, and just to kind of to contribute to this question is that I'm going to say something that may sound contradictory. I don't believe that writing is therapy, and I don't think you should write as a way to heal. If you need therapy, I always tell my students, if you need therapy, get a therapist. I don't think writing is necessary. Like, it may be therapeutic, but it's not therapy. But I have to say, in my first book, at least, and sort of the most prominent example in my life is that writing a memoir helped me understand who I am and look back at the decisions I made in life. And I didn't until then, I didn't realize how much I was motivated by my sexuality, that I was motivated by fear of living as a gay man in the Middle East in a Muslim context. And that has been the driving force of all my life, of every decision I've ever made to move, to study, what to study, where to live. And I didn't really kind of put two and two together until I had to write a book about it. So on some way, it was kind of like a Freudian session where I really achieved that moment of breakthrough and understood what has been motivating my life all along. But definitely, I have a kind of a richer understanding of my desires and my fears through talking to other people, to the people I interview in both Return and Brown, because I've often used, particularly in Return, I've used them as a kind of a combination of sort of signs for things to get better, for cautionary tales, for what to do and for what not to do. I think in this case, I used the characters in my book much more as sounding boards, as well as, try to flesh them out, of course, as characters, but they were definitely we were having a dialogue Not all of it comes across in the book, but certainly in our conversations and our interviews.
And Kamal, just to add to that, what you said about when you realized after that how much of your book was, or the writing of your book was motivated by, fear too, as well. I think it's the same thing for me. I think after I left Western, and I was writing here and there, not fully immersed in the writing, but I came out of Western really angry, and I had no clue why. And it was just kind of seeping out of every pore, and anything could set me off. And I did get a therapist. And so I had the therapist, and when I started writing, it did become therapeutic in the sense that I realized why I was angry, and it wasn't anger, it was fear. And it was fear of actually when I wrote out the story and I'd rewrite it, there'd be these aha moments when I realized, okay, all these things that you went through, you didn't get a chance to process them. Because during the time frame, I would tell someone, this happened to me, and they'd be like, no, it's 2010, racism is over, or no, that doesn't happen, or you were exaggerating, you were just, you took it you were too sensitive. And so all of that I had taken and assumed, well, it wasn't so bad. And so when I submitted my draft to my editor, I was like, yeah, it's a comedy, it's a book of essays, it's a humorous book of essays, and she was like, it's not. It's like, it's not humorous at all. It's really dark. And I was like, no, it's not. And the book writing became therapeutic in the sense that I gave myself permission to be like, okay, you went through something really horrible, and that's okay. And other people have gone through something really horrible. So it's okay to kind of take some of the humor out, put the humor in where it needs to be, but to give yourself permission to say, okay, that was dark, and that you were motivated by fear all this time. And that took a lot of time, but that came also through having the therapist. So the book cannot be your therapist. You still need, anyone who wants to write a book, I would highly suggest having a therapist, book or not, but it just helped me see things from a different perspective.
That's a lot to think about. I think a lot of self-reflection, a lot of looking at things from different ways, just from putting into words. I think it can be hard to reflect if you're not actively doing something towards thinking about those past stories and experiences. Okay, this kind of leads me to my next question. I love that both of your written works, they're so grounded in who you are, your truth, your story. You both mentioned how that can be tough sometimes, how therapy is huge about sharing that inner world, but how do you navigate vulnerability in sharing your stories?
Kamal, you want me to go first?
I had to put you on the spot, right?
Okay, I got this one. I think to me that was the hardest part of the whole process, was that, because it's kind of contradictory, because when I put myself out there, I would put myself out there, especially early in my career, people would say, oh, I read that piece of yours, it's so brave. I never thought of myself as brave. And it's not like, I'm not trying to flex and be like, oh, I'm so brave, or, I'm not brave. It's just that it felt really important and urgent to do, because I had the platform, I had the privilege to do so. And that I never considered it my story being my story. I always considered my story being so many other people's stories, because I'd heard it before. But being vulnerable and kind of writing about yourself, it's really scary, because you're putting your heart, your soul, your tears, and writing is such an isolating experience, especially when you're tapping into these memories, and a lot of memories are dark, or you haven't worked through, and you're sitting at your desk all day, all weekend by yourself. Putting that into your book, and then living in the world that we live in, where people can tear it apart so easily, that is really fear. That scared me a lot. And so did what people in my life would say about it. So I come from a really liberal family, but they didn't know what I was writing about. Like, they didn't know the content of the book until 2 weeks before.
Wow.
The book actually was in its physical form, like in an arc, because I was so scared. I'm like, how am I going to walk into a Christmas party? How am I going to go to a barbecue and explain this? And that type of vulnerability, when you don't even share that with your family, because you come from a family where you don't talk about emotions, how do you do that for everyone else? And that became a struggle. And so did my positioning as a mixed race woman. I was very terrified that, you know, someone would say, well, you're not Black enough or you're not brown enough. And that's a really big conversation. It's not one that we have so much here in Canada, but in the States, it's a very contentious issue. And so I was worried that I'd write this book and I refer to myself as Black, and, you know, I present as Black, I go into the world as a Black woman, and I would get so much pushback. And that was also scary enough to the point where I was like, I don't know if I need this book to come out. I can, you know, I can do something else. I can do comics or something. But it felt important, again, because there were so many stories out there where we were all talking about it, but no one was talking about it publicly.
That sounds absolutely terrifying, but so powerful at the same time.
Both,
Kamal?
yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna. This is amazing what Eternity just said. I'm gonna just lower the tone a little bit and say something that I simply ran out of time to write my first book. Like I was just like I kept putting off the deadline of putting off the writing because it was so uncomfortable to write a memoir, and I was just so not familiar with that language and that style, and exposing so much of myself. And then in my conversations with my editor, as I wrote, I think 2 chapters, and I sent it to him oh, is that okay? Is this where we're going? And he kept saying, I want more of you, like bring more of yourself. And and I kept putting that off until I actually literally ran out of, like, I had to submit it in like 4 or 5 months. And I wrote so furiously that I did not think about the vulnerability aspect of it. I just wrote it, and then only when I saw it in I think the advanced reading copy, when they send you that, and then it's finally actually a book. It finally, and I sat there and lived through it, and it finally hit me. It's almost like I was in a daze for the previous 5 or 6 or 8 months. It's like just writing and not thinking about what it all means to me. And I think and in that sense, I suffered greatly, because when the memoir came out, it caused a huge rift with my family. It made me very vulnerable in the public space, because it had the word gay and Muslim in the same sentence, which of course, you know, kind of was a lightning rod for a lot of extremists and haters. And this at the time when social media was really coming into place. And then, as much as I love Canada Reads, and I owe it, you know, the exposure of Intolerable on Canada Reads. Imagine your book that is you feel so vulnerable about being in a nationwide competition, and then hearing the panelists are trying, obviously, for their book to win or to move to the next round, tear it down on national radio. And I think that was I think I made that decision. I'm never going to write a memoir again after Canada Reads, because I mean, I would write something that has a lot of personal stuff, but I will always sort of frame it or put it in the context of reporting and political analysis, because I don't think I can go through the early years, the early months and reception of Intolerable, as many good things came out of it, as the award nominations and the prizes, but also the rift with my family was, you know, something that lasted for 2.5 years, and it was a really big, very painful chapter in my life.
There's a lot of pain in that story and in that experience that I hear. I'm wondering, where both of you talked a lot about the vulnerability of all of this, and I'm wondering, where do you find support? Where do you find mentorship or inspiration?
Oh, I think you know, also in other memoirs, you know, like Kamal. I think, you know, it's when you become a memoirist, or you know, you write personal stories, you kind of, there's like a kindred something, you know, somebody gets it. They know the struggle, they know all of this. And it's important, because I think what Kamal was saying, it's when you decide to put yourself out there, you risk a lot of things. You risk a rift with your family. You alienate yourself from your communities, whatever your community is, even your writing community. And to be real, there's a lot of infighting and a lot of jealousy, even within writing communities. And so trying to find your people is really important. And so I think since I've written my book, it's opened up my support system to find other writers, and that's been excellent. And then I think just having people who you've known for a long time, they may not get what you're doing, they may not even read your work, they may not know what a journalist does and how you do it, but they're there for you, and you could go to them at the end of the day and have your ridiculous conversations or have your serious conversations. And I think that is important, just people who are proud of you. And I know I'm proud of you so often that it's lost its meaning, but people who are genuinely proud of you, even if they don't know what you're doing, is really important.
Finding those people are so important.
Yeah.
How about you, Kamal?
I would say the same. I mean, finding people who really have your back is important in life in general. But just generally speaking, I would say that as a university professor, as a teacher, I found that supporting the next generation of storytellers and students and sharing that kind of helped me cope with the pressures of publishing and writing, and just find, or let's just say, I found a meaning in instead of just being constantly with my peers, I found the meaning in mentoring the next generation of storytellers and putting, seeing their work out there, whether it's memoir or reporting, gives me a lot of meaning, a lot of satisfaction.
Not only do you share, you help other people share too. I love that.
I'm just jumping in here, Kamal, I'm sorry, but like everyone that I went to school with, because Kamal was at Ryerson when I was a student, every student I know adores Kamal because he does just that. And so there really is something to that, right? Having people to look up to, and especially if you're a younger writer or you're a new writer or you're a student and you don't see a lot of books where people look like you or they don't have your experience, having kind people who are invested in you as a person and in your skill is so important, especially in journalism too, right? Or even creative writing, when you go in and you don't look like everyone else. And people want you to fight for your position to be there. Just having faculty members, staff members, anyone to kind of help you is really important. It means a lot to people.
And we nonfiction writers kind of, in a way, we feel sometimes we're stuck between fiction writers on one hand and journalists on the other. And there is not a general understanding of the craft and the art of nonfiction, of how we're the people who bridge both worlds in a way where we bring in a lot of the fictional elements, the scene setting, the storytelling, but we also bring in our for you and I at least, or people who have that sort of background is our journalistic style, and I don't think nonfiction gets the, and I'm so glad that your writer in residence program at SFU Library is a nonfiction one, because I actually think some of the most exciting things that are happening in Canadian literature today are happening in nonfiction.
I agree.
I'm biased.
I agree. I'm biased too. I agree. Totally.
I love that. This is a really good segue into one of the questions that I see in the Zoom Q&A. But before I do, I was wondering if Kamal or Eternity, did you have any questions for each other before we turn to the Q&A from the audience?
I think Kamal, you kind of just asked the question just now or you made a comment about the question I was going to ask, which is that they're always so far apart, right? So this is more of a comment, but being a journalist and, being a nonfiction writer, there's a process to it, right? It's not just we just write for the sake of writing. It's a craft, it's a skill, and it can be incredibly exciting. It can birth some really exciting ideas. It can tap into the cultural moment that we're in, and we can do that and make it engaging. And so I never quite understood this kind of contentious spot that we've been in as journalists and as nonfiction writers or memoirists.
Right, and I think maybe it's the term nonfiction is somewhat problematic for a lot of people. Like, what is it? If it's not fiction, then why is it called nonfiction? And you know, I mean, sometimes just, you know, literary journalism or literary writing. Some people, you know, like that term, but to me, it's all storytelling. It's different modes of storytelling, and I think even when we use, like I'm referring to your book, essentially, when you use statistics or studies, particularly to do with sort of say, you know, just say Black women and representation. That is a story in and of itself. It tells a larger story about the world that we live in, and what you try to do is the kind of put your story next to that bigger story, and together they create that, you know, an even bigger sort of narrative, a bigger story, that because from the collision of the personal with the very sort of contextual or political. But there is a craft to nonfiction, and I'm glad for everyone who's going to be working with Eternity in the Writer in Residence program. It sounds like you're running a few craft-based workshops.
Come get the craft. That's going to be the hashtag.
Yeah. I think that's really important, because I think you can learn the craft, and you still have to work on the language and your literary skills. But first learn the rules, and then start breaking them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. This question from the chat really intrigued me. But what do you think is the role of nonfiction works in resistant movements? How does nonfiction writing contribute to permanent social change?
It's right up Eternity's alley.
I know. There's some excitement. I'm like, wow. I think they contribute a lot. So I'm just gonna like rewind for a second. Everything that we know, if we think about slavery, think about Jim Crow, if we think about residential schools, etc., that has come from a lot of nonfiction and people writing their stories or being interviewed or history books. So everything that we know about where we were in the past so that we don't replicate that comes from nonfiction. Unfortunately, we replicate a lot of it, which is, you know, what a lot of my book is about. These are not new things. And so I think it plays a massive role in resistance movements, especially for journalists like Kamal and I, because we have the opportunity to present these facts and, you know, interview people and put that out there. And then what we do is we get people reading, consuming, and then being, you know, so outraged or so touched or so, you know, anything that they go out and act, because they've learned this new information and somehow it's changed their mind, it's changed their life, it changes how they interact with people who don't look like them, it changes how they interact with the people in their lives. And I think that is exactly, like, that's the power of nonfiction, is that it directly plays a role in resistance movements because it gets people out there, it gets them wanting change, and you never know where your work is going to end up. And someone told me that very, very early on in my career. You don't know whose hands your work is going to end up in. Mm-hmm. And I've been lucky enough where, like, my book has been in institutions. It's been at the highest levels in institutions. It's been, in police forces. It's been read amongst lawyers, and those people then, or decision makers or politicians, and then they get to make that change. And so the change comes from everywhere, and that resistance starts with words. Like, words are so, so powerful. So, in 100 years from now, people will be talking about all the books written by folks of these movements, right? Or resistance movements today, who were part of climate change movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. And they're going to have their stories. And then, they're going to pull on this stuff that's happening today. And so it's almost this, I don't know if it's circular, but it's linear. It keeps going, right? And that's how we build these movements. Everything we know about BLM today is we rely on what we know from the civil rights movement. When we talk about Black women being left out of movements, we know they were left out of feminist movements because they wrote about it. And so, I can go on forever because I love this question, but it's a lot. It does a lot for resistance movements.
Mm-hmm. Nonfiction is a spark, the story, and kind of the source of all social change. That's what I'm hearing from you. Kamal, did you have anything to add to that?
I have nothing to add to that. That was a definitive answer. Let's move on to another question.
Awesome. Okay, second one from the audience. It's a little bit of a longer one. As a journalist from Pakistan and entering a master's in international journalism at NYU, I grew so angry about international correspondents misreporting on countries like mine. It has put me into a writer's block over the past year. Have you both ever had to deal with the crippling scarcity of words that were so essential to you? And how do you get ahead of that?
I'm going to have to ask you to read that question again. That's just, sorry, it just.
I think it was about like writer's block. How do you deal with not knowing how to put really important things to you into those words?
Right. Well, I mean, it's okay if I feel this one because I'm someone who struggled with writer's block in the writing of return. I think there was a gap of like 4 months where at the beginning of the pandemic, before the pandemic, that I didn't write a word because I just couldn't. I froze and I couldn't return to it. And there are many strategies, and I think, sorry if I'm so practical, there are many strategies you can do to get around writing block. One thing is just to write from anywhere, write at any point. It doesn't have to be right from the beginning. Just start with writing. Another one that I found really helpful, if something is very difficult and sitting in front of the computer can be intimidating, I would actually dictate it to, I would just record it on my iPhone and just speak to myself basically, and then transcribe it later. Occasionally, I've also written with pen and paper when things were really complicated. There are many ways. I do find that the worst thing is staring at a blank screen, because that's torture. Get out, get off the computer, go for a walk, watch a movie, read for a little bit, and return later. If you are suffering, if the writer's block sort of continues, then there are a lot of prompts and exercises you can do, just to sort of the prompting element that a lot of creative writing schools use, just to get you writing, not necessarily the thing that you're working on, but just to get you again familiar with the process, just warmed up again, because writing is a muscle, and if you don't use it for a while, it does atrophy, and you kind of have to, just like going to the gym or whatever it is, you have to build up your strength again and start. Eternity, would you agree with that, or do you have any other tips?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think, I have writer's block right now, but it's mostly writer's burnout block. But I think if I recall correctly, the question was also about how do you put in words something that's so important to you, but you can't. And I think, Kamal, you said just about everything. I think the other thing is sometimes when those words are so important, or you're really upset or angry at how things have been reported on, I think that was part of the question, and you want to do better. Sometimes the words are there, but you don't know how to get them out, and we kind of censor ourselves, or we edit ourselves. And so even if you can just start, if you can just put something on the page, even if it doesn't make sense, and just, or the words or the emotions that you're feeling, put that on the page, and then you can start to go from there. Because there have been many times when same thing, I'm like, how can I say this? Or I know what I want to say, but it's not coming out. And it just kind of starts with just writing whatever is in my head, just words, sentences, phrases, images, and then working from there, because at least you have it out to see, and then you can start working around it.
Yeah, and all writing is rewriting, to be honest. Like, just get it out there. And you have to recognize that your relationship with your laptop or your computer, no one else will see this unless someone else is like creeping your computer behind your back or something. But I live alone, so I know that what I write is just for me. And once I actually kind of accepted that this is not ready to go publicly, this is not even my editor will see this, I started to relax a little bit, knowing that there is a process of rewriting and editing that will take that, jumble of sentences that I just wrote and make some sense of them.
Love that. That's a lot of helpful tips, I think, and I hope that this will help a lot of those aspiring writers out there. Just looking at the time, this might be our very last question. I'm very sad. But the previous question led into it. Do you have any words of advice for aspiring journalists or nonfiction writers that you want to share as we end off our event?
I would say read as widely as you can. Read underrepresented voices, but just read in general.
Yeah, I was going to say that, so I'll tweak it a little bit, but read read as much as you can. And if there's a style that you like, or, you know, if you're like, I want to be a feature writer, or I want to write profiles, then consume profiles, find the best profiles and read them and get a sense of the feeling of how they work and get a sense of the structure and all of that. And I think that's great. And also just writing every day. I think it doesn't have to be a lot. If you can just write even a couple of sentences just to keep the momentum going, like Kamal was saying, you don't want to kind of have your muscle atrophy. You just write every day. It doesn't matter what it's for, but I think that's a good way to just keep yourself in practice.
And never stop learning. I mean, whatever possible, take workshops, attend master classes, that kind of thing. Read writing about writing. I find that really sometimes not to craft, but just to kind of to know that I am part of a very noble and great tradition of writers who have struggled with writing and with writer's block or with inspiration or creativity or whatever.
Thank you for that. The journey never ends. So unfortunately, that looks like all the time we have for the conversation this evening.
So quickly.
So fun.
I know, yes. I wanted to thank you, Eternity and Kamal, for sharing your wisdom with us this evening. I certainly had a blast. I hope you did too, and I hope the audience did as well, listening to us talk about all these things. At this time, I'd like to turn it back to Gwen Bird for a few final remarks.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you. I too regret that we're coming to an end. That was wonderful. Thank you to Kamal and Eternity for your magnificent readings from the epilogue and introduction. They were like in reverse bookends there. That was great. And for the inspiring conversation tonight about journalism, about memoir, personal writing, the power of nonfiction writing. It was just so apt for the launch of our second for Eternity's term as writer in residence, as well as sharing something about your own stories and your own process as writers. So it was magnificent. Thank you. And Emily, you have just been such a gracious and thoughtful moderator. Wonderful, intelligent questions, and I love the way you engaged with Kamal and Eternity. So thank you very much. I'd also like to extend a big thanks to our event partner, SFU Public Square, and to Chloe Riley for all her work in coordinating and planning the library's involvement in this event and in helping to plan Eternity's residence with us. And a reminder to everyone that if you want more, as I'm sure you do, Eternity Martis will be hosting a series of workshops as well as offering manuscript consultations during her residency over the next 4 months. So you can find those in the link that was posted in chat, and please go ahead and register. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Thank you.